Welcome back. I want to talk to you about boundaries. Boundaries are crucial for your children. They have to have healthy boundaries. Without boundaries, they don't learn what they need to know to be able to make it in life. Without boundaries, they cannot form a healthy view of themselves, and they cannot have healthy relationships. The problem with boundaries is it's the primary source of conflict within your home, but it's a very necessary and good conflict. I post this saying on Facebook every now and then. It says, kids test boundaries to learn. Parents enforce boundaries to teach. I'm describing the conflict that happens around boundaries, and it's a very good conflict. This is how your kids develop. But a lot of parents, they tend to shy away and avoid that conflict. They don't want to be perceived as mean or cruel, or they just don't want to deal with the conflict. But the conflict is very necessary. When you have healthy boundaries for your children, they learn what is right and what is wrong. They learn what they're good at and what they need to get better at. They learn what is okay for them and what is not okay for them. They learn what is safe, what is not safe for them. It is very important that they learn these things about themselves, and it helps them form a good view of themselves. Second to having unconditional love for your children, the most loving thing that you are going to do for your children is to have healthy boundaries. It shows love. It shows that you care about them. It shows that they are important to you, that they are worth fighting for and even having conflict with, because you love them so much that you are going to make sure that they are prepared for life. It also teaches them about relationships. It teaches them that conflict is a part of every relationship. And as they get older and start forming their own relationships, they know that each person in that relationship has needs. They have things they want. And sometimes those things are in conflict. There's things that are just not good for you. But when a child has had healthy boundaries, they learn to work through the conflict. They learn not to let someone walk over them and to compromise what is healthy and good for them in order to keep the relationship going. They know how to speak up for themselves and to set healthy boundaries, and then to build the relationship by working through it. Boundaries are so important. Think about yourself for a moment. What was it like for you growing up? Were there no rules or clear expectations, no limits, no monitoring? Or were you able to figure out a way to get past all that and get what you want? At the time, as a kid, as a teenager, you probably loved it. But looking back, you probably realized you had to learn a lot of stuff the hard way. You had some heartache and some pain that you wish you did not have to go through. You probably wish there was a way that you and your parents could have worked it out to have some of those limits and to learn how to handle that conflict. Or maybe you were on the other end of the spectrum. Your parents had stifling, strict expectation, rules, boundaries, and there was no room to grow. They controlled everything in your life, and that was a really bad experience, and you don't want that for your kids. Or maybe your parents did a pretty good job. They had boundaries, they enforced them, and you're thankful that went well and you got what you needed as a child. But now you have a very challenging child, and they're doing things and acting in ways that you never did, that you never experienced, and you're really struggling to figure out, how do I set boundaries and how do I enforce them and what's the right thing to do? Well, we're going to show that to you. I'm going to work that out with you. I'm going to show you how you do that. I want to show you something that is going to explain how you use boundaries to help your children. And this is something that I actually draw out on a whiteboard when parents are working with me in my office. And I often get a lot of chuckles when I do that because I can't draw a straight line to save my life. And my circles look like ovals. It gets sloppy really quickly. I thought that'd be a little too distracting for you, so I use slides instead, but this is actually what I draw. So take a look at this. See this little guy? This is your child when they're born. And on the other side, this is your now adult child who is ready to move out of the home. And this line in between, this is what I call the straight and narrow path. This is all the choices and all the decisions, all the behaviors that you want your child to make, because you know that path is going to make their life a lot easier and a lot more enjoyable. Now, something that's really important to know is you can see this line pretty quickly. Whether or not you follow this yourself, because of experience, you now know where this line is. Children cannot see this line. And no matter how much you talk about where this line is, there is a need within children to find their own way. But we have to have some boundaries in place, because when we don't, here's what it looks like. We want them to follow this path, but very quickly they shoot off to the extreme and they get really far off course. And when they do that, they experience pain, they experience hurt, heartache, difficult time, and then they course correct and like, oh wow, that hurts so much. And then they come back towards the line, but they go right past it. They're only there for a moment, and then they're to another extreme, and then another extreme, and another extreme, and it just continues as their life moves forward. And the peaks of those extremes, that can be some pretty extreme behavior and choices and difficulties. That can be drug use, unplanned pregnancies, horrible relationships, legal trouble, all that kind of stuff. And when they get to their adult life, they are not only not equipped to handle life, but they're usually feeling pretty chaotic and out of control. And no one wants their kid going into their adult life like that. Now, sometimes there are kids who they just don't have very good boundaries at home, but they find a way to stay a little closer to that line. So maybe they kept up with school, they were encouraged because of a coach, and they didn't get too far out of control. But even those kids, when they get to the end of life, they're not very prepared for life. And that's where I see adults who really struggle with their self-esteem. I remember talking to this one young woman. She was in her young 20s, just had finished college, and she was very, very depressed. And she was telling me about her childhood, how her parents let her do whatever she wanted. And it was like they were just not there and they didn't care. Now, she made good choices for the most part. She would, she kept up with her schooling and sports and things like that. But she told me there was even times that she tried to cause trouble just to see if her parents would react, and they never did. So now as an adult, she's really been struggling with, wow, if my parents didn't even care that much for me, what does that say about me? And she was also having trouble with relationships because she didn't know how boundaries exist in relationships. So she had connected with this guy who was just walking all over her, and she was in this abusive relationship and depressed, and a lot of that had to do with the lack of boundaries in her life and just not being prepared. So we don't want that. Well, then there's this other extreme. Some parents say, well, I am going to make sure that my kids follow that straight and narrow path. And they set really, really tight restrictive boundaries, but they're way too tight. They're very controlling. And they do things like, we are going to tell you exactly how your life's going to go, and when you have a problem, we're going to fix it for you. We're going to make sure you stay on this. And they don't give their children enough room to learn from their mistakes and from their choices because they don't have any choice. And that causes all kinds of problems as well. I remember this family I worked with, they had 3 boys, and they were all older, and the youngest one was in his 20s at the point I started working with them. But they had these really rigid boundaries, and plus they weren't very nurturing. There wasn't a lot of I love you, I care about you. It was just, hey, follow this path, do what we say, and things will be good. Well, the first son, he rebelled against this horribly. He felt controlled. You don't care about me. You just want me to do what you want to do. So he was constantly rebelling, and he would even get into it with the father. By his teenage years, they were having physical altercations, and as soon as their oldest could, he dropped out of school, he moved out on his own, and very quickly he had all this rage, so he got in legal trouble and drugs, and really difficult start to his life. The second, the middle child, he was very compliant. He followed that path. He did what his parents said. He was their pride and joy. They were so proud of him. and he never questioned anything, and he just like cruised through life, great grades, great choices. But when he went to college, he completely imploded. For the first time in his life, he was confronted with choices and decisions in life that his parents could not help him with. And he did not know how to cope with that. He did not know how to take care of himself. And even though he had done all that stuff, he was not prepared for life, especially the difficult decisions you have to make. So, within a semester, he was back at the home and really struggling because he didn't know who he was, and it was really sad for him. The third child, their youngest son, well, he just kind of floated through his childhood. He was very quiet. He wasn't stellar with sports or his academics, but he didn't cause any trouble. He just kind of floated through. No one really paid attention to him too much. When he got to the point of going to college, he just went hog wild. He finally had all this freedom, and he went straight to binge drinking and partying and blowing all his money, making really bad choices. He did not know how to control himself. He didn't know how to make good decisions, and when exposed to total adult freedom, he just completely abused it and had all kinds of trouble. So, it's understandable why you would want to keep your child really close to that path, but if they don't have room to learn from their mistakes, if they don't have room to make their own choices and learn how to take care of themselves, that kind of boundary doesn't work. So let me show you another example. So in this example, this was a family I worked with, and at first, they did not have very clear boundaries. They weren't enforcing them. Their children were very challenging, and they were giving in a lot. And so the children were getting way too much freedom, and they're really starting to get far away from that line. But as the parents learned the importance of boundaries, they put some boundaries in place. And it was tough at first because I don't care what age your child is, if they have more freedom than they are ready for, when you take that freedom away, they will fight. I mean, they will they'll raise hell over that. But that's what these parents knew was important, so that's what they did. And they created these very healthy boundaries that weren't too close. And they used choices and allowed the children to see that they had choices to make, and they learned from their choices. And they kept that going until the point that their children had proven that they could make better choices, that they could take care of their lives better than they were doing before. And at that point, they started backing off. Now, they didn't back off in their values. They didn't back off in their morals. What they backed off in was control. They gave their children more control over their lives. It was basically like this: you have proven that you can take care of this and that you can make good choices, so we're going to back off and let you make more choices. We're going to give you more freedom. And that process continued, and that's why I call this the funnel, because it's kind of like a funnel effect. But check this out. You see these lines? See, children learn from experience. Yes, your words of wisdom are very important, that you tell them that stuff, but they're first going to learn from experiencing it themselves. So when you have boundaries in place, it holds them close enough to that line where they start to say, wow, this actually is a better way. What mom and dad say are true. This is a better way to live life. And once that clicks in their head, because your boundaries gave them that experience, they create their own boundaries. And that's what these lines are in the middle. This is where their children stayed closer to their path on their own. They stayed on that straight and narrow because they said, hey, this is a better way to go. Now, when these kids got to the point that they were ready to move out on their own, they were much more equipped, much more ready and able to take care of themselves. They had learned what they needed to learn about relationships, about themselves, and about just feeling confident to be able to handle life. So that's what we're going for. Now, this is an illustration. I promise you, when we get into step number 2, I'm going to show you specifically how you do this with your children. But I really wanted to hammer home how important boundaries are in your family. So the next lesson, we're going to talk about consequences, especially using natural consequences to enforce boundaries. And when you start putting all this stuff together, you see how it's really a great path and a great way to help your children out. So I will see you in lesson number 3.